You don't think as well as you think. Before you turn this video off, let's talk about why that is. Critical thinking is not taught in most education centers. I've spent time taking a course on critical thinking and that made an impression on me. Since then, I've spent hours looking into it and attempting to hone my own critical thinking ability, and I'd like to tell you about it. We'll be talking about what critical thinking is, the lack of critical thinking in the education system, the lack of emphasis as a life skill, and the greater self-awareness and problem solving it brings. The critical thinking course I took was 40 hours long, and even that short of a class made a large impression on me. Sure, I'd heard of critical thinking and even used it daily in my job, but I'd never actually considered the core components of it. So, what makes critical thinking critical thinking? What is critical thinking comprised of? Glad you asked. Critical thinking is comprised of 8 key elements of thought and 10 intellectual values. These values and elements allow us to free ourselves to an extent from our base nature and develop our intellectual traits. They also elevate us to conscious thoughts and decisions in all matters. This is according to Drs. Richard Paul and Linda Elder in their 2006 book titled The Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking, Concepts and Tools. For instance, let's take a daily choice we all make, getting out of bed in the morning. At its core, it's a question of whether we want the extra sleep or whether we want to keep our jobs. But subconsciously, decisions are being made. Our mind has weighed the options and most of the time chooses to keep the job. I don't consciously make that decision most mornings, and I'm sure you don't either. Critical thinking, however, simply brings those decisions and processes to light. Not necessarily helpful for my example, but in other much grander decisions that is a huge benefit. It brings a self-awareness to each decision, realizing our biases towards certain methods of thinking and certain end decisions. Critical thinking is critical to mitigating these. This leads us to ask why it's not a core part of our learning establishments, does it not? So, why is it not taught in the classroom? A 2006 article by Dr. Paul states only 9% of the instructors were clearly teaching for critical thinking on a typical day in class. This is in reference to a study he did in 1997 with Dr. Linda Elder and Ted Bartel titled A Study of Critical Thinking in College Instruction. My theory is that we haven't put the time and effort into improving lives and truly humanity by using critical thinking, beginning with ourselves. It is those biases and blind spots that we mentioned, so resistant to change, so unwilling to learn to see themselves. They are little self-preserving gremlins of thought, hiding in the shadows and stabbing anyone who would drag them out into the light. If each of us today learned and applied even half of the values and elements of critical thinking, each of your homes would be affected, from there your community, from there your city, so on and so forth. Each drop of knowledge sparks a ripple of learning. Critical thinking is critical. Hopefully, due to this, the next generation of learners would have a solid foundation of critical thinking on which to base their lives, their learning, and their decisions. This would start with the parents of today, of now, learning critical thinking, regardless of the old adage about dogs and tricks. They would then pass it on to their children and their children's children, etc. Parents need to teach critical thinking as early as possible. It is a life skill that will help their children in all aspects of life. With critical thinking as a learned life skill from a young age, the next generation will be more self-aware and more capable of making informed, reasonable decisions. For instance, consider you're purchasing a vehicle. Critical thinking will enable you to see things from other viewpoints, such as the salesman's or sales manager's, as well as your own. It might enable you to see in what ways they're trying to take advantage of you, and to reason if what they're offering you is beneficial to you or just to them. It will help you consider the long-term impact of your decision, to factor in your other financial responsibilities and whether it's a reasonable choice to make, or if that money would better serve you put into a different option, or maybe a relationship. You can reason through how your actions will affect your partner, or how your words will impact them. Looking at things from their point of view and rationally considering their opposing viewpoints, as well as holding your own viewpoint to the same standard, stops many fights. Try it yourself. Our biases and blind spots create many of the issues in our lives. Our unlimited capacity to think we are being reasonable at any given point when we're actually being very unreasonable. Thankfully, as I've mentioned, freedom from many of our biases and blind spots due to critical thinking allows us to see them and make a way around them. We are unable to remove them completely, but realizing that they are there brings an additional layer of self-awareness to our decisions. Critical thinking is critical to this. We've seen that the added self-awareness aids in every aspect of life, from relationships to jobs to a large purchase. I hope we've all learned something today, from what critical thinking is to the greater self-awareness and problem-solving it brings. Critical thinking is still not taught in many schools, no matter how long I talk. With all I've said, we can all go out and change our world. It just takes a little initiative and a lot of application. Thank you.